One of the quieter lessons of the Korean War is that survival knowledge does not automatically improve with time. By 1950, armies were better equipped, more mechanized, and backed by decades of modern military science. And yet, in Korea, soldiers repeatedly relearned lessons their predecessors had already paid for in World War II. Lessons about cold, exhaustion, sanitation, shelter, and the limits of technology under sustained pressure. The uncomfortable truth is that many of the most reliable survival practices in Korea were not new at all. They were older, simpler, and rooted in habits soldiers had sworn by a generation earlier. That gap between official doctrine and lived experience is where this story lives. If you value military history that examines what actually kept people alive rather than what looked impressive on paper, subscribe to Echoes of Valor. This channel exists to preserve the kind of hard-earned knowledge that rarely survives official summaries. To understand why certain World War II survival hacks endured, while others quietly disappeared, we have to look past manuals and focus on conditions. World War II forced millions of ordinary people into environments where systems failed routinely. What survived were practices that respected the body, conserved energy, and reduced long-term risk even when they seemed unimpressive. The soldiers who survived longest learned that staying dry mattered more than staying clean. One of the most consistent survival lessons across every World War II theatre was that moisture killed faster than dirt. In Europe, dampness led to trench foot and systemic infections. In the Pacific, constant wetness softened skin until it split and became vulnerable to aggressive bacteria. Soldiers quickly learned that chasing cleanliness at the expense of dryness was a mistake. Experienced troops prioritized drying socks, boots, and inner layers whenever possible, even if it meant wearing visibly dirty clothing. Mud could be brushed off later. Persistent moisture could not be undone once tissue damage set in. This practice carried directly into Korea, where cold amplified the consequences of wetness into frostbite and permanent injury. Modern militaries now emphasize moisture management as a cornerstone of cold weather survival, but the principle was refined by soldiers long before it was codified. Food preparation hacks focused on digestion, not flavor or calories alone. Another overlooked survival strategy involved how soldiers prepared and consumed food under stress. In theory, rations were nutritionally adequate. In reality, exhaustion, dehydration, and illness made digestion unreliable. Soldiers learned to modify intake to keep their bodies functional, heating food whenever fuel allowed, breaking rations into smaller portions, and avoiding overconsumption during short rest periods were common practices among seasoned troops. The goal was not fullness, but sustained energy without gastrointestinal collapse. Men who ignored this often paid for it during forced marches or combat engagements. These habits, really shaped post-war ration design and field-feeding doctrine. Korea reinforced the lesson brutally as cold weather and calorie deficits collided. World War II survivors recognized the signs early. Others, they learned the hard way. Popular memory often portrays World War II shelters as crude and temporary, but experienced soldiers developed surprisingly nuanced rules about shelter construction. Whether digging foxholes, modifying buildings, or erecting temporary cover, airflow and insulation mattered more than thickness or concealment. In cold environments, sealing a space completely trapped moisture and carbon monoxide. In hot climates, poor airflow turned shelters into ovens. Veterans learned to leave controlled gaps, elevate sleeping surfaces, and use natural materials to manage temperature rather than fight it outright. These principles were passed informally, often unit to unit. In Korea, soldiers who ignored them suffered higher rates of respiratory illness and cold-related injuries. Those who followed them endured longer, even with, inferior equipment. Foot care rarely appears in heroic narratives, yet it was honestly one of the clearest markers of experience. World War II veterans developed strict personal routines, airing feet during halts, rotating socks even when exhausted, and applying simple barriers like grease or powder when available. These practices were not about comfort, They were about mobility. A soldier who could not walk was, well, no longer combat effective, regardless of skill or courage. In prolonged campaigns, foot injuries actually removed more men from action than enemy fire. It's quite surprising, right? The Korean War, it exposed this gap once again. Newer troops often dismissed these habits as excessive until an injury forced them to reevaluate. Modern military podiatry, it owes more to these quiet routines than to any single technological advancement. Another hard lesson from World War II was that water management, it depended as much on timing and restraint as on purification. Soldiers learned not to drink excessively when resupply was uncertain. They also learned not to contaminate limited sources through poor discipline and not to rely on harsh chemical solutions that damage the body. Boiling when possible, filtering through cloth to remove sediment, and choosing upstream sources, these were common-sense practices refined through repetition. They might have lacked drama, but hey, they worked. Attempts to shortcut purification with aggressive chemicals often caused long-term harm, something medical officers noted repeatedly by the war's end. These lessons carried forward into Korea and later conflicts, shaping modern water discipline training that emphasizes sustainability over chemical force. Perhaps the least discussed survival advantage was cognitive. WWII veterans developed routines not just to save time, but to reduce mental fatigue. Fixed sequences for gear checks, food preparation, and rest allowed the mind to recover during moments when the body could not. Under constant threat, decision fatigue became dangerous. Simple habits preserved clarity under stress. This principle later influenced training doctrine focused on drills and standard operating procedures, not as rigidity, but as psychological protection. Korea demonstrated what happened when units lacked this discipline. Confusion multiplied exhaustion, and exhaustion multiplied mistakes. The value of mental conservation, first learned informally in World War II, became undeniable. What these survival hacks reveal is that, durability always beats cleverness. None of the practices soldiers swore by were flashy. They did not rely on special chemicals, experimental techniques, or dramatic improvisation. Instead, they respected biological limits, environmental reality, and the slow grind of attrition that really defines real warfare. World War II stripped survival down to the fundamentals. The hacks that endured did so because they actually aligned with how bodies function under prolonged stress. Korea confirmed that alignment, and later conflicts reinforced it again. Understanding this really matters because modern audiences often mistake innovation for progress. In reality, the most reliable survival knowledge is often old, unglamorous, and honestly, earned at tremendous cost. Remembering these lessons is not about nostalgia. It is about honesty. If you value history that examines endurance, failure, and adaptation without myth-making, go ahead and subscribe to Echoes of Valor and share this video with others who care about serious military history. These stories still matter because the conditions that forged them have not disappeared, and neither have the consequences of ignoring them.